Right, this is going to be about procedural foliage, and just quickly going to go through the terrain that I created in World Creator. This is 8129 by 8129 terrain. Then I've just added a few layers here. I made it an island, so you can see the edges of the terrain as dropped down to create a nice area where the water will, because I want to surround this by water so you can see the water plane a bit better, and I want to create the appearance of an island. Then I just added a few more textures, filters here. I also have an area set up where I wanted to, this desert area here, you can see it. I just made this area dunes, and then I just created a few textures, grass, sand, rock. The sand and rock is so the sand uses a slope between 0 and 65, but it has a cavity of concave, and then the grass is the default, so it'll be everywhere, and then the rock should be slope from 64 to 90 degrees. And then I've also added snow with the height select, and then this is where that dune, you can see I've just allocated this area here, allocated this texture to dunes, and then I've also created a mud texture for where the ocean would be, or the shoreline. So if I just quickly show the ocean plane, this was then exported to Unreal Engine. Right, and then what I did was I also have an ocean plane that I brought in, and we'll go through the procedural foliage generator now. And then what I did was I just included some rocks as well. I also painted a few paths using the landscape spline tools, which you can see here. Here's a little path. Now the terrain has already been textured using the same method I used previously, which also includes grass. So you'll see there's a grass shader on this. And then here's a little road that's just using the sand texture. And here's another little road here that uses it's just a different road texture, and it's a smaller road. And you can see the grass isn't growing, or the sand, whatever. The grass shader doesn't work on that layer, terrain layer. And then what I've done, I've also just manually added a few rock meshes here, using the same. So you can see when I move in the texture scales in, it has two different texture scales, one for far away viewing and one for closer. Okay, then the procedural stuff. Let's start with the blockers. I've added a few blockers. There are these little blocks, these little outlines that you see here. I'll highlight them more quickly so you can see them. And that's where I do not want procedural foliage to spawn. And then I like to layer my procedural foliage. So typically what you would do, or what I would do, I'm going to start, I like to number them as well, and you can see they encapsulate my entire terrain, right? You could also see that from a different viewport. So let's start with the the first layer that I would place. I'm just going to move it over here. So this one has a few rock meshes assigned to it. There's the random seed here. I don't think I've actually changed this value. I'm just going to show you how I did this one. Well, maybe we can do a few edits rather. That might be more useful. So I'm using rocks FT, FT1, 2, and 8. So rocks FT, FT1, I'll select FT2 and FT8. Where are you? This guy here. Right click and just go edit. Then it will allow you to edit common properties. So you can see they do share a lot of the same properties. Things that I normally change are obviously the Z offset. These guys, if you look at, let's just look at this one here on its own. And then we'll go back to those, maybe. This boulder here is really large. See, in the default view, it doesn't even show, so you have to press F to get out of view. This boulder is massive. If you look at the approximate size, 7,000 by 7,000 by 6,000 by 6,000. That's pretty big. That scale was done. I think I did that scale here. Let me just check quickly. Okay, no, not in this case. I didn't. Sometimes I do change the scale here, but not in this case. In this case, this is actually how I modeled this rock, scaled it, and re-imported it. So these would typically be really big boulder types that I would like to place first of all around the level. Now, I don't care about aligning them to the normal, so I do want them to have a random yaw, and I don't care about the pitch angle, so I'm giving it a random pitch angle between 0 to 180. And then ground slope angle, I also don't care about here. I think I set this to 0 to 90 degrees. And then I only want them to spawn on the grass and rock layers of the terrain. The minimum layer weight, I didn't change anything there, and the values here are the values that I fiddled with the most. These are very fiddly, and sometimes when you do change these values, your generation may crash. So just save often before you hit that simulate button, and it can crash for various reasons. Most of the time, I found it's I think it's, is it memory? I have 32 gigs DDR4. Is it DDR4? Yeah, I think 32 gigs DDR4 gaming memory. But when you start placing millions of hundreds and thousands or tens and thousands of objects, even though they're being rendered instant, it does have an impact. Okay, so I've set the number of steps to 0 and the initial seed density very low because I don't want these to be very lush. These little big boulders must be not that often. And I also set the seeds per step very low to 1. And then I set the max age, I think, to something like, I haven't changed the max age. I did change the procedural scale because these rocks were too big. So I scaled them down between, you can see between 30% and 75%. Now, this works with the scale curve and the age, meaning I think this value up here is age, where between 0 and 1, where 1 would be age 10, right? So it's normalized. So there it would be max scale of 0.75. That's the scale curve that I have. And the minimum, when it's just born, it would be at scale 30%. That's kind of the way this works. So yeah, I'm not going to select those guys again, no need to. So let's run this simulation, and then obviously to create these, I mean, that's really simple. You've seen this done in many tutorials before. Also the terrain in that, I'm not going to show, the terrain or the grass shader or stuff like that, because I did that in previous tutorials. So to create your procedural foliage, you would literally just start, just find my test folder here. And just go, is it under miscellaneous? Procedural foliage spawner, and there's a procedural foliage type. Okay, it is this guy. Let's see. Yeah, no, it's not right. I'm looking for procedural foliage type. Foliage type. Right, so it's under miscellaneous foliage type. I'm actually busy with something else now in the game, so I haven't worked with this now for a few months. Okay, so you would choose your mesh here. This is where you would choose which mesh you want. This is the class that allows you to override your foliage instance static mesh component. Allows you to go and create your own, or in C++, or I suppose Blueprint, I guess, if you really want it, but I doubt it. Rather do C++. You can override the materials, and I do in some cases, which I'm going to show now. And then you would change these values, right? Then you would create a procedural foliage spawner. Now this allows you to go and add your types. So you would add your foliage type in here, right? Sort of the way that this would work. And then what you do is you simply drag the procedural foliage spawner into the level from your content browser, and you just fiddle with, you can fiddle with either the brush shape here, or you could change the scale. They take the brush shape takes the scale into consideration when they run the sim, so I just prefer changing it in the brush shape, but I think it works anywhere. Okay, so then the first one I'm going to run, this should be placing large-ish boulders across the terrain. These boulders here were manually placed. I placed these here manually. There's a couple here on the snow as well, some snowy boulders that just use, it's the same meshes, just with the snowy material applied. So you'll see in my boulder folder here, here's the normal boulder, and then I've just got a snowy type of material. Now, arguably, could be more or less snowy. Okay, so back to what I'm trying to do. Foliage spawner, I'm going to hit the resim button here. Now, because these are very sparsely populated, and at first it looks like there was nothing, because these all use culling as well. So the culling is set up in the foliage type. If you go to the foliage type, the culling is normally set down here. So I'm setting between 50 and 55,000 for these boulders. I think that's okay, because the trees and that is actually going to mask this out pretty nicely. But you should go very high for your boulders if you can. Like those boulders there are disappeared now when I changed the game mode. But typically you'd want them to stay visible from very, very, very far away, because it does look very noticeable when they pop. Anyway, so this is what this spawner did. It placed these boulders here on the grass and on the sand. Those were my chosen layers. Now what I'm going to do, it might also spawn on the sometimes in the path. Just here you can see it did, because just purely these things are too big, right? So the center of this boulder, it doesn't do a bounding box check to see if it's going to infringe on here, you know, and that's okay. You could play with your seed values until you find something that works. You could come in here and try and put a procedural blocker in here, but for the most part it doesn't really bother me. Or you could move the road. You know, it's very simple to just come in here quickly and just change the spline. Anyway, so what I like to do next is I like to save. And then, I don't know if other people experience this, but I've experienced this before, where I have this procedural foliage spawner, that I'm using like I am using it now. I'm not doing this in code. And I'd like to remove these boulders, and I didn't find an easy way to do it. I ended up deleting the spawner and then re-adding it, and then I have to remember to set the values here. In this case, for the foliage, for this foliage spawner, I'm telling it to spawn on the landscape, BSPs and static meshes. I don't mind if it spawns on static meshes. I don't mind if it spawns on these big boulders, really. Typically, they're not going to be, you shouldn't be doing this when there are buildings and things here, right? That's why you put these blockers here. These blockers here are to block off the spawner so it doesn't spawn in here. It's saying, okay, I want to do something else in this area that's not going to involve procedural foliage. So anyway, back to my point was, if you want to remove these, there's a quick way. You just untick those options there, hit resim. You're going to find in a little message there sometimes you don't. And that's it. They're gone. It's very, very nice. Nice way of quickly respawning something. Now, if I do find at some point, as I'm going through these layers and spawning, I have to change something on a previous layer, I can't come in here and just change this layer and respawn it. You have to undo everything you've done up until that point, because that's just how I've set this up. I don't like to put everything in this spawner here. I don't want to put all the boulders, the smaller rocks, the bushes, the vegetation, and then the sandy and the snowy trees and rocks and bushes and the dead trees and things like that in one spawner, because I find that becomes extremely messy, and it's just it's prone for it's very error prone, crashy. Okay, so I'm going to hit resim again. Let's save that and move on to the next layer. So for the next one, this is called the Snowy Large Spawner. Now this guy has only 2 types, and it's my snowy boulders here. And you can see what I've done here is I've actually overridden the material. So I'm still using that boulder 1 large again, but I'm reusing, specifying a different material to use. All this, the other settings are basically still the same as it was previously. So let's hit that. Oh yeah, and then obviously a thing to, that's not what I wanted to do. And then a thing to note is these guys will should only spawn on snow, the snow layer, the landscape layer snow. So you'll see on my, obviously on my landscape terrain, I've shown this before, but on my landscape terrain, this is the material instance. I'm just going to go to the, I have these set up already. I did show how to do this before, but you'll see I have these landscape layers. Grass, sand, rock, cobble, mud, and snow, right? So let's hit spawn on the snowy guys. And here I'm saying don't spawn on static mesh, just to show you what will happen if I do tick here, allow static mesh and hit sim. Let's see if it did it. See if we can find a static mesh. Yeah, here. So this is a bug. You could probably go and fix this yourself if you wanted. It doesn't know that this static mesh is on a not on a snow layer. It doesn't care. So when you're doing these layered this layered approach, and you only want something to spawn on a very specific layer, you can't use allow static mesh. So you can't have, because this just looks weird. I don't want these snowy boulders in the middle of the grass and sand. So I'm just going to untick allow static mesh and hit resim. They should disappear, and they actually did. But they will be here now. They'll be around my snowy layer. Just gonna hit save here. So another thing to note quickly with the spawner type, the slope select. I didn't explain it really that nice, but the ground slope angle. So this says it will only be placed on surfaces sloping in the specified angle ranged from the horizontal, meaning you can use this as a slope select to say I only want these little boulders to spawn where the ground is between these angles, between 0 and 90. So that's very nice if we want to control where something can spawn based on the steepness of the terrain. Right, next I'm going to do rocks. Now these rocks, you're going to see the same thing here, but these rocks, there's quite a few of them. Now this might look like they're calling the same mesh as before, but it's actually not. This is calling it using a different mesh. It's using a smaller mesh. You can see the approximate size here is 191 by 239 by 182. And it's got different settings as well. I'm using for this guy, the stuff I want to focus on here is, so number of steps here is 1, and the initial seed density is still 0.1. The age, distribution seed 32, so I changed that as well. And then the max age, I might not have changed that. Anyway, max age is 10, and then here I'm actually going procedural scale between 1 and 10. So at birth it'll be of scale 1, and at age 10 it will be max 10 times its scale. Let's run this guy, and these guys should also only be spawned on the grass and sand layers. Grass and rock. But I do think it depends on the layer blend. Like here you can see the grass shader is actually shading on top of the sand, which I don't mind because it's probably hitting that 0.5 threshold. Okay, let's hit this guy. And also here I'm choosing don't spawn on static meshes. I don't want these little scatter rocks spawning all over the place on static meshes because it looks weird sometimes. Okay, that wasn't too bad. And then you can immediately see them here. You see these little rocks here. So they're also not very dense, but it's starting to add up now. When I hit 7, I'm quickly going to do a play just from here and just check the frame rate, because it's also a good idea for me to keep an eye on the frame rate. It should be sitting at 120 frames per second now, getting around about 8 milliseconds per draw. That's what I should be getting. And okay, obviously because of the stream, it's taking a little bit of a hit. I could be wrong, but yeah, generally these are not very heavy. You can see it's trying its best. It's doing 119, 120, 119, 120. Sometimes the frame jumps up to 9 milliseconds. Perfectly acceptable for what I'm trying to hit. I'm running on a GTX 1080. So let's do these snowy small. So this is the same thing again. Now you can see there. So I don't mind if these guys spawn on here. That's fine. Okay, so let's do this guy. It's going to be the same thing, small little scattery type rocks, but I want to spawn them specifically on the snow layer, and I've overridden their material to be snowy, and I'm not spawning on static meshes. So let's hit that. And you can immediately see them here. Also to note, my snow uses a different shader as well, grass type. So you can see these little rocks. Let me just quickly save. Everything so far should have collision on it, so if I try and run into this, I shouldn't be able to. And if I try and hit some of these smaller rocks, where are they? Here. So these guys also should have collision. You can see I can't run through them. And these were procedurally spawned. Also, a quick way to tell if something was procedurally spawned or not is just click on it and you'll see when it does this, then you know. You You can see there's quite a lot of them. But some of these I placed manually. So I think like these guys here, if I choose that guy, you can see that wasn't procedurally spawned. Right, so let's go and move on to the next one. Now I'm doing sandy rock, so let's jump on over to the dunes here. So you can see here they're still getting, and then obviously in the blockers there's nothing, you know, just the grass type. But there's no meshes spawning in here. Let's go to somewhere where I blocked off piece of land over there. So you can see here as they're spawning and then they just stop. So you could build in here or do something and then place your foliage here manually versus painting it, or even paint it here or whatever you want to do. Gives you a nice chance to do that. Let's move over to the sand here for a second. Typically I wouldn't make lakes like this. I would make sure that the water level of the ocean doesn't actually reach here, or just lift this up and just make a lake manually, you know, using a proper lake plane, and just build the lake plane in here, because I find obviously the ocean texture doesn't look nice as a lake texture, obviously. All right, so let's do the sandy rock. So it follows the same vein as what we did before. So these rocks will all have their materials overwritten to use the sandy rock look. And here I am actually choosing allow static mesh. I don't mind if the sandy rocks go onto static meshes in the snow or on themselves, not on themselves, on the bigger boulders in the grass and sand and rock. So that's what they look like, these little rocks here. That's all it does. It just adds a little flavor there. Right, so now we've got these little rocks, and then in this area here there should be none, and then on some static meshes we'll find some of them as well. So now we've done quite a few rocks and different kinds of rocks. Now the last bit of it's actually the heavy bit, bushes and trees and vegetation. So if I just play from here, I should be getting a pretty decent frame rate. Just gonna see if I can get somewhere. So yeah, here it's hitting 120. Let's go out of the snow, and here it's dropping to 90. And typically it wouldn't drop that bad, depending on how busy the machine is. And this isn't too bad. And as you can see, I have a lot of overdraw, but that's fine for what I'm aiming for. Okay, now we get into the heavy stuff. So the next thing is going to be this bush here. So I'm letting them spawn everywhere, just these guys, and you can see I have quite a few here, and they all follow more or less the same kind of properties. Some of them have collision and some of them don't. So not all of them have collision based on the vegetation itself. But you'll see they have more. The num steps are higher. The density is a little bit higher, but they use a very low seeds per step. And then I also use like a 25% up and down scale for the age. And if they do have collision, I would set it. Otherwise, I would set it to no collision. And they're only drawn max 50,000. So let's do these guys. All right, we're back. So you'll find these will obviously take a lot longer to spawn. I didn't make them that lush, so there are some nice spaces in between them on the grass plains, which is kind of what I want. me just hit save here quickly, and then I can just quickly show one or two of these meshes. They were created using SpeedTree, using exactly the same method I showed in one of my previous videos. So using that same technique. There's a couple of different kinds here. Anyway, so if we hit play now, you should see a drop in frame rate. So it should be between 10 and 20 FPS drop. Depending on how thick you go, how much overdraw you have. You can see the plants. I know there's a lot of white and red. That's actually the grass. But if you look at the plants, they're mostly green for the most part. And there's some red, you can see here and there, some red. So the plants are pretty well optimized. But still, just because they're using vertex animation, they are heavy. These guys here will have collision on, so you can't run through these. I do not have collision response on these, so you can move freely through some of them, and obviously it looks a little weird. There are tutorials on how to set up mesh collision on these guys, collision responses, so that they actually respond. But I want to move on now. Let's do the snowy bushes. So if we move on over to the dunes, there shouldn't be any vegetation here, right? I'll start here from the grass. There aren't any here. And then let's quickly do the snow. And these are set to spawn on the snow layer. And I've actually created a snowy bush, and I do show how to create this snowy bush on a cheaty way to create a snowy bush using subsurface and ambient occlusion cheating. Okay, so I'm going to hit simulate here. I don't want it to spawn on static meshes. And I think this allow static mesh doesn't include spawning on procedurally generated static meshes. Otherwise, they might end up going into spawning on top of something they've just spawned now. So I think that's why they did it. So that static mesh means something that you've placed in the level manually yourself, as far as I know, because I haven't seen them spawn on static meshes other than ones that I've manually placed in the level. So you could use that to your advantage, and which is why I like to start with a blank or empty world, place the blockers, and then just layer these foliage spawners. And in the same way, like I said, if I wanted to go back now and change something that I did in layer 5 here, okay, I would go and untick these, hit resim, tick them back, go to the previous level, untick all of them, hit resim, tick them back until I get to that layer, and then it would remove those in the same order that you've added them. And because you're using seeds, they should all spawn back into the same place that they were before. You're using a known set seed. I'm using whatever the default is, 32 or whatever. All right, we're back. So now we should have some vegetation here. Just want to hit save on the snowy areas. So sometimes it might look like it's not responding, even though it hit 100%. It might take a couple minutes, sometimes quite a few minutes after it's hit 100% before it will actually come back. You'll see your mouse change from the mouse pointer to this crosshair when that happens, or just go and do something else for a while. I'm gonna hit play and just check the frame rates here. Still should be similar to what it was before. And again, there shouldn't be too much red and white here. You can see there's a little bit of overdraw. And then the areas that I've blocked off will not contain any vegetation, as you can see here. This is just coming from the grass type. All right, now we move on to trees. For my trees here, I have quite a few. Let's show one or two. I did show how to create these in a previous video as well, so here's one. They do have collision on the branches only, and I set that up quite easily. I did show how to do that, I believe. Let's check another one. These are created using SpeedTree with the Unreal Engine subscription. And I did show how to create these. They all have LOD and billboards set up and all of that. These are going to be spawning on the sand, sorry, on the grass layer only, I believe. Let's confirm. Grass. And just quickly, some options here. The num steps are 1 again, so it's pretty low. Density is less than the vegetation, than the bushes rather, 0.3. Seeds per step is 3. Max age 10 again, and again the 25% up and down for max age. So at birth it will be 75% of its max of its scale, and then at age 10 it would be 1.75. Well, 175%, I guess, would be correct. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so let's run the sim here. The bushes actually took longer than the trees. So you can see the spawning was really quick, but now we're sitting and we're waiting for the UI to, and all the other background processes to finish. They should rather just change that progress bar to include these background processes as well. And there it's done. That was actually really quick, so I'm not even going to cut that out or pause it or anything. So let's move in and check the trees. Now my draw distance on these trees are not that high. I think let's quickly check. Culling distance 90 to 100,000. I would crank that up further. I would crank that up to 500,000 even. I'd probably want the trees to be visible everywhere, because they'll be billboards, so they'll be very, very cheap, you know, relatively. Let's save. Haven't experienced any crashes or anything like that. Sometimes you might get crashes. If you don't suspect system or memory or resources or anything like that, start removing your foliage types from your spawner, and you might find which mesh is actually causing the problem. Sometimes it can be caused by an invalid mesh of some kind. There are various reasons why meshes would be considered invalid. The list is quite long. So now we should be seeing another, I don't know, between 5 and 10 frames per second drop expected. And if I increase the draw distance here to 500,000 or always visible, it might drop a little bit more, but you should still be way above 60. So I'm targeting 30 for the end result on a high-end PC on full ultra. Also keeping in mind, this is not, I wouldn't consider this photorealistic by any means. It looks okay, you know, it looks all right. It's possible. Obviously, there are games that look far better than this. So it's up to you to make these meshes look as good as you can, and still keep them optimized. You know, that's the beauty of this. I'm just showing you my way of doing this. So like I said, these trees have collision, so you can't run through the the branches, but the leaves don't have collision. So if I can find a spot here, let's see, can I jump? That wasn't great. So you can see, you can see I'm clipping through. I should be clipping through the leaves, which is cool. So that'll also give you a little bit of a performance boost. I showed how to set up that collision in Speechy earlier. So let's do the snowy trees quickly. It's exactly the same thing again. I've got some snowy trees here, foliage types. They only spawn on the snowy snow layer, landscape layer. And I'm not using override materials. I'm actually using a snowy tree. It was created using the same way, using that subsurface color cheat. Let's hit resim on this. I'm not spawning on static meshes. This should be quick. So the placement is really quick, but then from there, the rendering, I think, the initial rendering and caching, maybe it's caching, I'm not sure what it's actually doing. They should just include that in this. So I'm just waiting for my mouse pointer to change to a crosshair. This machine is very quiet, so I can't really hear if it's doing anything. And then again, I have a few machines here. Right, it's done. And there they are. Hit save. That should be a habit by now. And typically what I would do is after I've done all these layers, I would then just back this project up or sync it to Git or whatever you're using, Perforce. And then I'd start with the next goals. And let's just hit play from here. So the leaves look green when you look underneath, but on top they look white. And here you can see a little bit more. It's more of a drop. So I'm hitting mid 80 FPS now. This should be hovering around about 90, I think, normally. And it's not blocky, or it's not getting stuck or anything like that. It's not laggy. I'm just looking at my OBS window here, and it looks a little bit laggy in the OBS window. So this is not laggy at all. There's zero lag, and I mean I'm pretty mobile here. I can move around. Okay, so then I just want to check one more thing. Let's check the blockers. So I set up a blocker here, and as you can see, there's no trees, no vegetation in here. So you can come in here and build or do whatever you want. I set the vegetation to spawn on static meshes, and this is a static mesh that I placed here manually before, so that's expected. Let's move on over to this area here. You can see it's clean, so you can do some cool stuff here without getting interference from the procedural foliage spawner. Now, typically lakes, see the trees are spawning inside of the lake, so that's why I put those blockers on top of these other lakes to block them. So that's what I would do. And like here, you can just increase the block size. So let's just do the final touch, final spawn. The dead trees. The dead trees are just trees with no leaves, really. Some broken branches. Nothing special. They're pretty ugly. They're not very dense, and I want them to spawn everywhere. This one is set to sand and snow, not on grass. But I've set this to spawn here, allow static mesh, so it will appear somewhere in static meshes to look like something died on top of a rock, something like that. Let's hit this resim. Let's give it a second, and it's done. And you can see the effect immediately. So there are the dead trees. Might be a little bit too many of them. It's spawning them in little clumps or little clusters, and that's cool. Let's hit save. The saving will obviously take more time now, so you got to start saving more strategically. Try and find a nice balance between how much work you do versus how much work you lose if you don't save now, versus how long you have to wait. I'm just hitting play, and I just want to check. So here we're obviously getting a really nice frame rate because it doesn't have to do much. So that's in the blocked off area here. You'll see nothing is spawning in here. Let's just move off to the some static meshes here, and you can see here what is what I was talking about. So it's spawning dead trees on here, which is what I wanted. Now you could come in here and play with these, you know, the number of seeds, the distribution, and the density, and play with those settings until you find something you like. And simply just by coming in here, changing some settings, and then just hit resum. You don't need to remove them first. It'll update automatically. Some of them will stay, obviously, because you're using a random seed. If you were to change the random seed in one of your types, then yes, it would typically go in and remove what was there before, and then they would you would see a much more visible change. And just one thing to note here as well is the mud. I moved the ocean up higher on purpose because I just like the way it looked. But typically you'd need to probably drop the ocean to your mud layer or your shoreline layer or whatever. Otherwise you're going to have stuff that's going to be spawning where they shouldn't be. And then that automatically removed the lakes as well. Then you can come in here and create your lakes in here manually. All right, I think that's it for this video. We're currently in the middle of a massive production, so I don't think I'm going to be making any videos anytime soon again. Probably until we've started some characters, maybe. We'll see. So this isn't going to go into the company channel. This is going on my channel. Because it doesn't really have anything to do with the game that we're making. So, yeah, cool. I don't think it's as tough as they make it out to be. The forest certainly doesn't look, you know, as great as you see in some of the posts. But, you know, you can come in here and you can add some fog effects, add some falling leaf effects. And it creates realism, and add some more. You know, you can, instead of using just these dead trees, you could use fallen logs. You're going to be adding more paths and things like that. Yeah, it's a really cool and powerful tool. Wow, it's an hour. I only wanted to make 20 minutes. Right, thanks for watching, and see what happens next.